Have you ever felt like you aren't deserving of something? Those who call ourselves Christ followers believe that there is a God who loves us unconditionally, so much so that it would be impossible for God not to want us. Join us for this 3-week series as we dive into the unconditional, redeeming love of God through a story that many of us might be familiar with, but one will see in a whole new light.
Well, welcome to Meck's online campus. I think most of us have heard the phrase, flesh it out, or fleshed out. If you're in a planning meeting and somebody brings a proposal that's a little thin on details or specifics, it's not uncommon for someone to say, gosh, we need to flesh this out a little bit more, or you need to flesh this out a little bit more for us. Which would mean, if this was a one-page précis, you need to go to 3 to 5 pages before we can really get anything out of this. Or you might be getting ready to pick out a good beach read for the summer. But the one you had in mind you read was critiqued for not fleshing out its characters very well, meaning they were thin or superficial or no real background or depth. To flesh something out means you put meat on the bones. You bring it to life. You make it a full and complete picture that is unmistakable and rich and varied in its complexity. Well, last week we kicked off a series on a remarkable section of the Bible that records how God asked a man named Hosea to live out a parable before the people of Israel, to flesh out God's message in a tangible, physical way. Now, there's all kinds of ways you might imagine God doing that, maybe with a prop, or having him do an object lesson, or to draw a picture, or to build something visual, maybe to create a play or a musical. God didn't ask Hosea to flesh it out in any of those ways. When he wanted Hosea to flesh things out a bit, he literally meant for him to use his flesh. He told him to go and marry a prostitute. The prostitute was to represent the people of Israel and their spiritual adultery, their spiritual promiscuity. They had abandoned the one true God and chased after false gods made of wood and stone, and even gave them names like Baal was the most prominent one, and then began worshiping these false gods. For 350 years, God's people had been descending into ever greater levels of apostasy, ever greater levels of every kind of evil and sin, ever greater levels of rejection of the one true God. Hosea was one of the last prophets that God sent after sending prophet after prophet after prophet. This was God's last great effort to call the people back to him, to call them to their senses and avoid the judgment that they were bringing on to themselves. Which is why Hosea wasn't to just marry a prostitute, but to do something else. As part of his prophetic word, God called him to marry a woman who was a known prostitute, and then to be faithful to her no matter what, to stay true to her no matter how untrue she might be to him. Now, the reason God did this was for Hosea's life to serve as a reflection of God's faithfulness to people, his people, despite their rejection of him. Okay, that was kind of like the way we talked about it, was the first act of the play. It was all about who we are in relation to God, which is the adulterer, someone unfaithful, because it wasn't just a picture of Israel, it's a living picture to this day of any unfaithfulness that we might have toward God as well. That's the nature of our betrayal of his love. That's the picture. That's what God wanted us to understand. That's radical habitual unfaithfulness. And adultery, which is what he's calling it, is relationally the ultimate betrayal. So it's a very serious situation. Now, I know we don't like hearing that. In fact, I once heard somebody talking about it this way. They said, we don't want to be seen as the unfaithful person, the adulterer, the sinner. We don't want to say we want to say I didn't sin. I wasn't unfaithful. What we want to say is I just made a mistake, which the dictionary says is an error in action, or it's poor reasoning. So when it happens, we can just say, my bad, my mistake. But there's a big difference between a sin, this kind of raw, habitual unfaithfulness, this spiritual adultery, and a mistake. If everything is dumbed down to a mistake, then that just makes me a mistaker. If you're just a mistaker, all you have to do is, just do a little better next time. But if I'm a sinner, that isn't going to be enough. What you did was intentional. It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. And that's what God was trying to say through Hosea. We have purposefully, intentionally chosen a life of spiritual promiscuity. We have cheated on God. But where is God in that picture? I mean, that's who we are, but who is he? How is he with all that? And see, that's the second act of the story that we're going to explore. The second part of this fleshed out living parable of our relationship with God is not about our actions, but God's feelings about our actions. So let's dig in. Here's how the book of Hosea begins. It says, when the Lord first began speaking to Israel through Hosea, he said to him, go and marry a prostitute so that some of her children will be conceived in prostitution. This will illustrate how Israel has acted like a prostitute by turning against the Lord and worshiping other gods. So Hosea married Gomer. Okay, that's where we left off last week. Here's what happened next. And she became pregnant and gave Hosea a son. And the Lord said, name the child Jezreel, for I am about to punish King Jehu's dynasty. Quick note. Jehu was the king at the time of the 10 tribes of the north. The kingdom of Israel had divided into 2 kingdoms, rose right after the reign of King Solomon, and you had the 10 tribes of the north, and you had, that was called Israel, and then 2 tribes of the south, which is called Judah. And this was the guy who was king of the 10 tribes of the north at that time. He was the last king, the one that judgment would eventually fall on for the whole 350-year decline. Well, soon Gomer became pregnant again and gave birth to a daughter. And the Lord said to Hosea, name your daughter Lo-ruhamah, not loved, for I will no longer show love to the people of Israel or forgive them. After Gomer had weaned Lo-ruhamah, she again became pregnant and gave birth to a second son. And the Lord said, name him Lo-ammi, not my people, for Israel is not my people, and I am not their God. Okay, let's stop there. During their marriage, they had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. We have no idea whether they were actually Hosea's. I mean, she was, after all, habitually unfaithful. What's key are the names. In the Bible, someone's name was very significant. It was in the most ancient of understandings, a name expressed someone's essence. To know someone's name meant that you knew their nature, you knew their character. They in essence, were their name. So what were the names of these 3 children? The names that God intended for them to have to continue to flesh out his message literally through Hosea. Well, let's find out. The name of the first child, a son, was Jezreel. Now, Jezreel literally means God sows, like sowing seed, planting seed. But here it's referring to a place, a town named Jezreel. And that carried a lot of symbolism. There was a great judgment, a slaughter, actually, that took place that was directed by God in that town. There was a man named Joram who was, at that period in time, king of the 10 tribes of the north, known as Israel, and Ahaziah was king of the 2 tribes of the south, known as Judah. They were both incredibly evil men. Joram was the son of Ahab, who is called the most evil king that had ever lived to that date. The scriptures even say that no one had ever provoked God's anger more than Ahab. But Joram's mother, Ahab's wife, was even worse. Her name was Jezebel. Yeah, the Jezebel, the one whose name is used as a euphemism for evil and treachery and deceit to this day. And let's just say that when it came to their son, Joram, who succeeded his father Ahab as king, the apple didn't fall far from the tree. Through the prophet Elisha, God set apart a man named Jehu to not only exact judgment on the 2 kings, but Jezebel as well, who was still alive at the time. It's all recorded in the books of the kings in the Old Testament. Let me read it. The prophet poured the oil over Jehu's head and said, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anoint you king over the Lord's people, Israel. You are to destroy the family of Ahab, your master. In this way, I will avenge the murder of my prophets and all the Lord's servants who were killed by Jezebel. The entire family of Ahab must be wiped out. I will destroy every one of his male descendants, slave and free alike, anywhere in Israel. I will destroy the family of Ahab, and dogs will eat Ahab's wife Jezebel at the plot of land in Jezreel, and no one will bury her. And that's exactly what happened. Jehu and Ahaziah were both shot and killed by an arrow. Jezebel was thrown from the top of a tower. Before they could get down to her body and carry that away, she had already been devoured by dogs. And it all happened in the town of Jezreel, a place whose name became synonymous with the judgment of God. So the name of the first child was a sign that the monarchy of Hosea's day would suffer the same fate as that suffered by the house of Ahab. It would be eliminated violently by divine judgment if they didn't turn. The name of the second child, a daughter, was Lo-ruhamah, literally not loved. This was to make it clear that there were limits to how long God's love would be extended and rejected before ultimately God would have to bring the relationship to an end. The name of the third child, another son, was Lo-ammi, literally not my people. And there was a reason given. They were not God's people because God was not their God. They had chosen false gods. Okay, these were the prophecies of doom that God wanted Hosea to convey. Very clear pictures of what would happen, what the outcome would be if they did not turn away from their false gods and return to the one true God. They would be Jezreel, violently destroyed. They would be Lo-ruhamah, not loved. They would be Lo-ammi, not my people. Now, this is something we don't often think about, because it's obviously not pleasant, but that there will be consequences for our decisions, our choices in relation to God. Even though we get it as parents and the children we're raising. One of my daughters has a line with her kids that always makes me laugh. They do something they shouldn't do and they disobey and they start to do it again, and she'll say, "Do you need a consequence?" And you just see their little heads kind of turning, do I or don't I? It's up to them. And it's up to us too. But with God, the consequences are more than something like the loss of privileges. With God, the consequences are the loss of God. And there is no greater consequence than that, because it forces God to name us, soon to be destroyed, unable to be loved, and not one of his children. And doing that, naming those children those names, brought God no joy. It broke his heart that it had come to this. And make no mistake, we have an emotional God. People often don't think about that, but we do. God has feelings just like we do. God is personal with a personality. This is a very unique feature, quite frankly, that the Christian faith brings to bear. It's very unique among world religions. In Hinduism, reality is this impersonal Brahma, the whole of which we are individual parts. You kind of like the Force of Star Wars. But the biblical idea is so much different. God is personal, an individual being with self-consciousness and will, capable of feeling and choosing and having a relationship with other personal and social beings. God even has a name. And we know what that name is. When the great Jewish leader Moses asked him for it, God gave it to him. And here's the answer he gave to Moses. God said to Moses, "I am who I am. This is what you are to say. I am has sent me to you." And that name, I am, is considered to be the most holy word in existence because it is the very name of God. It was considered so holy that the Jews wouldn't even write it completely out. They would only write the 4 consonants. They wouldn't put in the vowels. And it was YHWH. Scholars used to think that it would be pronounced Jehovah. So if you ever heard the name Jehovah for God, that's why. But we now know that Jehovah was not how it was pronounced. The closest we can make of the actual name in light of the missing vowels is that it was actually pronounced Yahweh. God said, "My name is Yahweh. I am." And you find him knowing and communing with humans and having all of the capacities associated with personality, knowing, feeling, willing, acting. So God is not some kind of federal bureau or department or a machine or a computer. He's a knowing, loving, good father who can be approached, who can be spoken to, and in turn speak back. And when we hurt him, he hurts. And that is what the book of Hosea records for us next. The fleshed out parable of God's people rejecting him and becoming spiritual prostitutes, and the emotional relational pain of that coupled with the unavoidably nightmarish names of the children of that prostitution, each given by God to flesh out what awaited them if they remained relationally unfaithful, brings us to what comes next. It reads almost like a personal diary, a journal entry of the emotions of God, a kind of a vomiting out of feelings born from the pain of our unfaithfulness. It's unfiltered. It reads like a raw, open wound, because it was. Let me read it. But now bring charges against Israel, your mother, for she is no longer my wife, and I am no longer her husband. Tell her to remove the prostitute's makeup from her face and the clothing that exposes her breasts. Otherwise, I will strip her as naked as she was on the day she was born. I will leave her to die of thirst as in a dry and barren wilderness, and I will not love her children, for they were conceived in prostitution. Their mother is a shameless prostitute and became pregnant in a shameful way. She said, I'll run after other lovers and sell myself to them for food and water, for clothing of wool and linen, and for olive oil and drinks. For this reason, I will fence her in with thorn bushes. I will block her path with a wall to make her lose her way. When she runs after her lovers, she won't be able to catch them. She'll search for them but not find them. And then she'll think, well, I might as well return to my husband, for I was better off with him than I am now. She doesn't realize it was I who gave her everything that she has, the grain, the new wine, the olive oil. I even gave her silver and gold, but she gave all my gifts to Baal. But now I will take back the ripened grain and new wine that I generously provided each harvest season. I will take away the wool and linen clothing that I gave her to cover her nakedness. I will strip her naked in public while all her lovers look on. No one will be able to rescue her from my hands. I will put an end to her annual festivals, her new moon celebrations, her Sabbath days, all her appointed festivals. I will destroy her grapevines and fig trees, things she claims her lovers gave her. I will let them grow into tangled thickets where only wild animals will eat the fruit. I will punish her for all those times when she burned incense to her images of Baal, when she put on her earrings and jewels and went out to look for her lovers, but forgot all about me. Well, that's just a taste of the pain and frustration and anger and nausea of God. If I had to try to summarize that, it would be, God saying, look, I loved you. I still love you. And I've given you everything. Every good and perfect gift in your life came from my hand. I was the faithful, devoted husband. But you ran after every man you could and slept with them. And the gifts I gave you, you gave to them. So I'm done. I just can't take this anymore. You have treated me with utter contempt, utter disdain. I gave you everything because you were my everything, but I'm obviously nothing to you. Is that kind of raw emotion surprising to you, coming from God? It shouldn't be, because God has feelings too. Think about it through just what we know and understand about emotions. When and marriage counselors and others have charted out what happens when in a supposedly committed, faithful relationship, it's betrayed. When trust is broken, you go through a series of feelings that tear away at your soul, and if not confronted, will tear away at the relationship. The first feeling is simply a deep sense of betrayal, and you feel deceived. It's as if everything you built the relationship on, everything you thought you knew, is just ripped away. The sense of personal violation, personal betrayal is just immense. And then that's followed by grief. Not just raw sadness, because you've been hurt, you've been wounded. The relationship has been cheapened, has been treated with disdain, which means you have been treated with disdain and you have been cheapened. There's just this profound sense of loss. It's like a death has taken place. Well, we know that's how it works with us as humans. God is no different. Here's how Philip Yancey paraphrases the feelings of God toward us in regard to our unfaithfulness as they are conveyed through the great prophets of the Old Testament, like Hosea. He says to imagine it as if God is sitting in a counselor's office as a client, and the counselor says, tell me how you really feel. And then God answers, I'll tell you how I feel. I feel like a parent who finds a baby girl lying in a ditch near death. I take that girl home and I make her my daughter. I clean her. I pay for her schooling. I feed her. I dote on her. I clothe her. I hang jewelry on her. And then she ups and runs away. And I hear reports of her living a life of debauchery and sex with anyone. When my name comes up, she curses me. I feel like she's just taking a knife and sticking it in and twisting me in my stomach. I'll tell you how I feel. I feel like a man who falls in love with the most beautiful, sensitive woman in the world. I find her thin and wasted, abused, and I bring her home to heal her and to make her beauty shine. She's the apple of my eye, and I lavish gifts and love on her. All this, and yet she forsakes me. She pants after my best friends, my enemies, anyone. She stands on a boulevard, and she pays people to have sex with her. Unlike common prostitutes, she doesn't even charge for her services. I feel betrayed. I feel abandoned. So what you have recorded in Hosea is simple. You have the cries and pain of a wounded lover. But don't detach yourself too much from that. I've been kind of pushing us toward that all along. What would God's journal entry be for you? What would your actions cause him to feel? I once read a prayer written by a man about his unfaithfulness to God. This is some of what he wrote. He said, I have fallen, Lord, once more. I'm ashamed. I don't dare look at you. Instead of looking at you, I turned my head away. I stepped aside while you stood silent and sorrowful, like the spurned fiancé who sees his loved one carried away by the enemy. All of a sudden, I found myself alone, ashamed, disgusted with my sin in my hands. This sin that I selected, the way a customer makes his purchase, this sin that I have embraced while turning coldly away from you. I forgot you because I was thinking of myself. And one can't think of several persons at once. One must choose, and I chose. And your voice and your look and your love hurt me. Have you ever voiced a prayer that so acknowledged what you had done and how it made God feel? But is that just where it ends? We're unfaithful over and over again, and at some point God's just done. Is there hope? Can there be forgiveness? Can there be reconciliation when there's been so much habitual unfaithfulness? I mentioned that this story of Hosea and Gomer is akin to a 3-act play. Act 1 is God making it clear who and what we really are, spiritual adulterers. Act 2 is how God feels about it, which we've been walking through today. The hurt, the anguish, the pain. Not just over our promiscuity, but where that promiscuity will lead. We will be Jezreel, violently destroyed. We will be Lo-ruhamah, not loved. We will be Lo-ammi, not God's people. God will be forced to give us those names. But does it end there? Is that the final verdict? Is there no hope? We can just push God too far and then it's just over. And then when that line is crossed, it's just done. And what if we've already crossed it? It's a lot of questions, I know. And for answers, we'll have to wait for the 3rd act of the play. One that brings us to a resolution of this whole story and have the whole parable be fleshed out in its entirety. But for now, let's live with the 2nd act of the play. We need to live with not only our spiritual adultery, but that is what our unfaithfulness is to the heart of God, but also we have to live with how it makes him feel. Because let's be honest, we can be flippant about the emotions of God. I can be flippant about them. Even as his people, even as those who say we follow Jesus, we just don't think enough about how our unfaithfulness makes him feel, what it does to him. We don't even try to imagine his emotions and how he feels. Can you imagine coming to Jesus for forgiveness, for spiritual adultery, only to then go back into that lifestyle and not even care, not even think about what it means to him, and even worse, to make it seem like now that we've come to him and been forgiven, we can cheat at will? I'll never forget hearing Tony Campolo talk about this once. For years, he taught at the University of Pennsylvania, and he had one of his students tell him that while he knew he shouldn't be sleeping around and doing a lot of other stuff, it just wasn't that big a deal. Because God, he said, was all about grace. It was all about forgiveness. Tempola said that he just didn't grasp the fact of what this was doing to God, and that he didn't grasp the fact that every time he hooked up with somebody or, date raped somebody, that he was just crucifying Jesus again. He said he wished that when that guy was doing his thing in bed that he could hear the agonizing screams of Jesus. He wished he could hear Jesus crying and wailing. He wished he could experience what Jesus is going through at every moment of what he is doing. Because when you sin, you are driving another nail into the hand of Jesus. You are once again lancing him in the side with a spear. And it's not just the wounds of the cross made fresh, but the wounds of the heart. So before we get to the third act of this story, let's come to grips with who we are and how God feels about our choices and lifestyles and actions and betrayals, and determine first things first, before we see whether there's grace and forgiveness. And if it does run out, the way Hosea is kind of, portraying the severity of it, what's first things first? Do you want to stop the adultery? Do you want to stop breaking his heart? Do you want to be committed to God? Do you want to stop this callous madness? Do you want to quit sleeping around in ways that prostitute yourself before him? Do you want to quit making him ashamed? Do you want to quit running after other lovers, selling yourself to them? Do you want to realize how amazing God has been to you, how every good and perfect gift in your life has come from his hand? Do you want to quit seeking out ways to be unfaithful to him, wantonly pursuing them with disdain for his love? Instead of forgetting about God, do you want to remember him? Well, let me give you a hint of what we'll learn in the third and final act of this very fleshed out play. The hint is that that's all God's waiting for. It's why he had Hosea marry Gomer in the first place, to demonstrate faithfulness in the face of unfaithfulness, not for the purpose of condemnation, but to show how reckless his redeeming love can be. But there's a little more to it than that, and we'll get to it all when we walk through that last, final, pivotal act of this amazing, fleshed out story. Until then, let me pray for you. Father, Hosea hits hard. The story hits hard, and it's meant to. And we don't want to pull the punch because we want to have said to us what you want said to us through it. If you wanted this fleshed out so that it would be unmistakable, we don't want to strip away any of that flesh. I just pray, Father, that however this needed to fall on people, including me, that it would. We'd wrestle with it, we'd think about it, we'd own it, we would absorb it, we wouldn't brush it off. It's intense and serious, but that may be exactly the voltage we need for our life. So whatever you wanted to say to us through it, through not just the first act, but the second act of this story, help us get it. And I pray that in Jesus' name. Amen.